Hey everyone, great to see you. I'm excited to dive into this story with you today. It all started back in my hometown.
The sun had baked the land so long that even the dead orchard seemed to be holding its breath. And right there, under a white-hot sky, a lone widow was digging trenches through rows of withered peach trees everyone else had already given up on. This story reminds us that the people the world laughs at today may be the very ones who save lives tomorrow, and that wisdom, patience, and quiet courage still matter. By the time Evelyn Brooks drove into Whispering Mesa, the town looked like it had been forgetting itself for years. The paint on the feed store was peeling. The church lawn had gone yellow around the edges. Dust rolled across Main Street in thin, restless sheets, gathering against porch steps and truck tires like it meant to stay. Out past the last mailbox, beyond a sagging fence and a rusted cattle gate, sat the orchard she had bought with the last of the insurance money. 43 acres of cracked earth, hundreds of peach trees long gone gray and brittle, a farmhouse with a slanted roof, 2 broken shutters, and a porch that groaned like it remembered better days. To the people in town, it was a foolish purchase. To Evelyn, it was the only place that had been quiet enough to hear herself think. She parked the truck beside the porch and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither she nor her son moved. Noah sat in the passenger seat, thin shoulders stiff, one hand wrapped around the strap of his backpack. He was 12, but grief had a way of making a child look older and smaller at the same time. "This is it?" he asked softly. Evelyn looked out at the rows of dead trees stretching toward the hills. "Yeah," she said, "this is it." He didn't answer. She could tell what he was thinking. That this place looked nothing like a second chance. That it looked tired, abandoned, and a little bit heartbroken. Just like them. Her husband, Daniel, had been gone 11 months. A highway accident on a late delivery run. One icy curve. One phone call at 2:13 in the morning. And after that, their whole life in Flagstaff had begun to feel too crowded with sympathy, casseroles, lowered voices, and the unbearable kindness of people who didn't know what to say. So Evelyn had done the one thing nobody expected. She left. Not because she was running away. Because she was trying to survive what was left. The first week in Whispering Mesa, folks watched her from a distance. They saw the widow in work gloves, hauling scrap wire, broken barrels, bent sheets of tin, and old irrigation pipe out of the back of her truck. They saw her walking the orchard before sunrise with a notebook in one hand and a shovel over her shoulder. They saw her kneel in the dirt, crumble it between her fingers, study the slope of the land, and stare at the dry wash behind the property like it was telling her something. At Benton's Hardware, a man named Caleb Turner leaned against the counter and smirked when she bought post hole diggers, gravel mesh, PVC connectors, and 3 rolls of heavy tarp. "You planning ghosts out there, Mrs. Brooks?" he asked. A couple men near the coffee machine chuckled. Evelyn didn't flinch. "No," she said evenly. "I'm preparing." Caleb gave a short laugh, like that answered everything and nothing at all. Preparing for what? That question followed her everywhere. But Evelyn had been noticing things. The stock pond north of town was lower than it should have been for June. The creek bed behind the elementary school had dried out 2 full weeks early. Cottonwood leaves were turning pale underneath. Birds that usually nested near water had shifted farther west. And the wind felt wrong. Too hot in the morning, too dry at sunset. Like the whole valley was being slowly emptied from the inside out. So while the town waited for rain out of habit, Evelyn began cutting shallow channels between the orchard rows. Not to grow peaches, not yet. To catch every drop the land might still be willing to give back. Every swing of the shovel blistered her hands. Every trench pulled sweat down her spine. And still, she kept going. From the porch, Noah watched her one evening as the sun dropped low and red behind the trees. "You really think this place can work?" he asked. Evelyn leaned on the shovel and looked across the dead orchard, at the hard ground, the fading sky, the silence. Then she looked at her son. Her voice was tired but steady. "No," she said. "I think this place might help us do more than survive." And out in the dying light, with dust floating gold through the trees, that broken orchard no longer looked empty. It looked like the beginning of something nobody else could see yet. By the second week, the town had settled on what it thought about Evelyn Brooks. She was the widow in the dead orchard, the quiet one, the one digging holes in a place nobody had wanted for 10 years. In Whispering Mesa, people were polite to your face long before they were kind in their hearts. They would hold the door for you at the diner, then shake their heads once you walked out. Evelyn knew the difference. She had grown up in small towns. She knew how judgment traveled. It moved through grocery lines, over church casseroles, across gas pumps, and between sips of coffee before sunrise. Still, every morning, she was up before daylight. By 5:30, she would already be outside in her old denim shirt, work gloves, and scuffed boots, walking the orchard rows with her notebook tucked under one arm. The sky at that hour still carried a little softness, pale blue, faint pink, the kind of morning light that made even tired land look almost forgivable. She would stop, crouch low, and run her hand across the soil. Dry on top, cooler underneath. That mattered. She studied the slope of the ground, where runoff would move if rain ever came, where dew collected longest in the shade, where the roots of the old peach trees still held the earth together. She wasn't guessing. She was reading the land the same way some folks read scripture. Slowly, carefully, with respect. Then the digging started. Shallow channels first, then wider catch, basins between rows, then stone-lined pockets where water could settle instead of disappearing. She hauled broken concrete, old cinder blocks, rusted mesh, and discarded pipe from all over the property. Nothing was wasted, not if she could help it. From the porch, Noah watched her with that same guarded expression he'd worn since they left Flagstaff. He helped when she asked. He carried tools. He dragged brush. He held the end of measuring tape while she marked out the next trench. But he still hadn't fully stepped into it. He was 12, old enough to understand people were laughing. Too young to know how little that mattered. One afternoon after a trip into town for nails and feed, he sat in the truck longer than usual. Evelyn noticed. "What happened?" she asked. Noah stared out the windshield. "Nothing." She waited. That was one thing grief had taught her. People spoke when silence felt safe enough. Finally, he said, "Those boys by the gas station asked if we were farming dust." Evelyn rested her hands on the steering wheel. For a second, something hot and fierce rose in her chest. Not shame, not even anger exactly. More like the old ache of wanting to protect her child from every small cruelty the world handed out so casually. But she kept her voice even. "And what did you say?" He shrugged. "Nothing." She nodded once. "Sometimes that's the right answer." He turned and looked at her then, hurt written all over his face. "But what if they're right?" Evelyn glanced out toward the edge of town, where heat shimmered above the road. "They're not asking because they understand what we're doing," she said. "They're asking because they've never had to build something before anybody believed in it." Noah looked down at his hands. That stayed with him. A few days later, help came from the last person Evelyn expected. Martha Jane Whitaker arrived just after lunch in an old Buick with one faded blue door that didn't match the rest of the car. She stepped out wearing slacks, a straw hat, and the practical expression of a woman who had spent her life doing things that needed doing. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just opened the trunk. "I brought jars," she said, "and 2 old county maps. My late husband kept everything. Lord knows why." Evelyn walked over, wiping sweat from her brow. Inside the trunk were glass jars, a box of weathered notebooks, and rolled maps tied with kitchen twine. Martha Jane glanced across the orchard. "You're either foolish," she said, "or paying closer attention than the rest of us." Evelyn gave the faintest smile. "I've been called worse." That earned the first hint of approval from the older woman. The maps turned out to be useful, more than useful. One showed the original irrigation lines from 40 years earlier, back when the orchard still produced fruit by the truckload. Another marked an old holding pond that had been filled in long before Evelyn bought the place. The notebooks were filled with seasonal rainfall notes, hand-drawn observations, and practical farming records from years when people still respected slow knowledge. That evening, Evelyn spread everything across the kitchen table. Noah leaned over one shoulder while she traced faded pencil lines with her finger. "There," she said quietly. "See that? Water used to move through here." He squinted. "But that was years ago." "Water remembers," Evelyn said. "Land does too." The next morning, Lila Mae Carter showed up on a bicycle with one loose handle grip and a backpack half-zipped. She stood at the gate like she was trying not to look too eager. "My granddad says you're digging yourself into a heat stroke," she said. "But I was wondering, are you building some kind of system?" Evelyn studied her for a second. Lila Mae wasn't mocking. She was curious. That was different. "I am," Evelyn said. Lila's eyes lit up. "Can I watch?" Evelyn handed her a shovel. "You can do better than that." By sunset, the 3 of them had cleared brush from a low stretch on the west side of the property, where the ground dipped just enough to hold runoff. It was hard work, dusty work, the kind that left your shoulders burning and your socks full of grit. But for the first time since arriving in Whispering Mesa, Evelyn did not feel like she was building alone. And still, beyond the orchard fence, the town kept on talking. At Benton's Hardware, Caleb Turner laughed when somebody mentioned the widow's trenches getting deeper. "She's making herself a fancy little mud pit," he said. A few men laughed with him. But outside, the sky stayed empty. The wind stayed hot. And each evening, when Evelyn lowered a marked stick into the old well behind the house, the water line sat just a little lower than it had the day before. Not enough for panic, not yet, but enough for a woman like Evelyn Brooks to understand one hard truth. This wasn't a dry spell anymore. Something bigger was coming, and she was running out of time to get ahead of it. By July, the heat no longer felt like weather. It felt personal. It pressed down on Whispering Mesa from the minute the sun cleared the hills, hard and merciless, turning porches into stovetops and truck seats into punishment. The air had gone thin and mean. Even the breeze, when it came, offered no comfort. It moved across the valley like a hairdryer, hot enough to sting the eyes and dry out your throat before you finished a sentence. Everywhere Evelyn looked, the town seemed to be shrinking. Lawns had disappeared into brittle yellow patches. The flower boxes outside the diner were empty. By noon, Main Street usually sat half silent, with people moving slower now, conserving energy without even realizing it. At the orchard, Evelyn kept working. The trenches were deeper. The stone basins were nearly finished. The first filtration bed she had built near the west side of the property was holding better than she had hoped. Not full, not even close, but enough to prove the idea was sound. Enough to keep going. She and Noah had fallen into a rhythm that no longer needed much talking. He carried gravel in dented buckets. She checked the slope and adjusted the channels. Lila Mae came by most afternoons on her bicycle, sunburned across the nose, eager and dusty, asking questions the whole time. Why line this one with stone and not the other one? "Because this one needs to slow the water down," Evelyn said, tamping dirt with the flat side of a shovel. "If it rushes through too fast, the ground can't take it in." Lila nodded, serious as a little engineer. Noah, kneeling beside the trench, glanced up at his mother in a way that had changed these past few weeks. He was still grieving, still quiet, but now there was something else growing alongside the hurt. Respect. One morning, just after sunrise, Evelyn stepped behind the house and lowered the measuring line into the old well. She let it drop, waited, then pulled it back up. Her mouth tightened. 3 more inches down. Not dramatic enough to send folks running into the street, but enough to make her heart knock once, hard against her ribs. At the diner that afternoon, the talk had shifted. Not everybody was joking anymore. A rancher from the north side of town said his cattle trough was running low before breakfast. A woman from the church said the elementary school had shut off 2 of the bathroom sinks to save pressure. Somebody else said the creek bed behind the football field was bone dry all the way through. Caleb Turner, standing by the register with a cold soda in his hand, still tried to laugh it off. "It's a rough summer," he said. "That's all. We've had bad ones before," but even he sounded less certain than he had a month ago. The first real crack in town came a few days later. The Hollis family's well gave out just after dark. By morning, they were hauling plastic jugs from a cousin's place 20 miles away. Then another house on the east end reported muddy water coming up through the pipes. Then another. Like dominoes, quietly, steadily. The panic didn't arrive all at once. That wasn't how it worked in small towns. First came denial, then inconvenience, then irritation. And only after that, fear. At the orchard, Noah began seeing it for himself. Not in newspaper headlines, not in speeches, in people. He saw a boy from town filling gallon jugs at the church spigot, with his little sister holding the caps. He saw 2 elderly men arguing in the grocery aisle over bottled water like they were fighting over gold. He saw Sheriff Ben Holloway standing outside the town office with his hat in his hand, talking in a low voice to 3 farmers whose fields had already started to fail. That evening, Noah came home quieter than usual. Evelyn was at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, reworking numbers in the margin of Martha Jane's old county map. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then asked, "Are they really going to run out?" Evelyn looked up at him. There was no point lying now. "Some of them will," she said softly, "if they keep doing what they've always done." He swallowed. For a second, he looked younger again. Just a boy, tired, scared, trying hard not to show it. Then he asked the question she knew had been coming. "What about us?" Evelyn leaned back in her chair. The kitchen was warm. The old fan in the corner clicked every few seconds, doing more for sound than comfort. Outside, the sky was turning amber over the dry rows of trees. "We're not safe yet," she said, "but we're ahead." That mattered. Ahead did not mean safe. Ahead meant there was still time to choose wisely. A week later, the heat climbed higher. The town posted voluntary water restrictions. Church services were shortened. The cafe stopped serving free ice water unless people asked. At Benton's Hardware, folks began buying up hoses, containers, tarps, and pump parts with the frantic look of people trying to solve in 3 days what should have been understood 3 months earlier. And then, one blistering afternoon, Lila Mae collapsed in the orchard. She had been helping Noah drag a roll of wire mesh across the west side when her knees simply gave out under her. 1 second she was talking. The next, she was on the ground. Noah shouted for his mother. Evelyn was there in seconds, dropping beside the girl, one hand steady at the back of her neck, the other reaching for the water she kept wrapped in wet cloth beneath the porch shade. "Lila, hey, stay with me." The girl's face was pale beneath the dust. Her lips were dry. Her breathing had gone shallow and uneven. Evelyn moved fast, with the calm of someone who understood that panic wastes precious time. She got Lila into the shade, cooled her wrists, gave her small sips, waited, watched. When Martha Jane arrived to take her home, she stood very still beside the first holding basin, looking at the filtered water gathered there. Not much, but real. Real enough to save a child on a day like this. She lifted her eyes to Evelyn, and for the first time there was no doubt in them. By sunset, word had spread. The widow in the dead orchard had water. Not plenty, not a miracle, but enough to make people look toward her fence with something they had not shown before. Not mockery, not pity, need. And in Whispering Mesa, need had a way of changing the story faster than pride ever could. The next morning, people started showing up before the sun was fully over the hills. Not with apologies, not with humility. With empty buckets, coolers, jugs, and that strained, brittle look people get when fear has been riding beside them all night. Evelyn saw them through the kitchen window while the coffee was still brewing. A pickup from the east side. Martha Jane's old Buick, Sheriff Ben's county SUV. And behind them, 3 more trucks easing up the dirt road toward the orchard gate. Noah came up beside her, still sleepy, his hair sticking up in the back. "They're here already?" Evelyn nodded once. Outside, the air was hot even at dawn. That was never a good sign. Morning was supposed to offer mercy. Lately, it hadn't offered much of anything. She stepped onto the porch and closed the screen door behind her. Nobody spoke at first. Sheriff Ben took off his hat and held it in both hands. His face looked older than it had a week ago. "We've got a problem at the town tank," he said. "A crack opened sometime overnight. Pressure's almost gone." Evelyn felt the words settle deep. Not surprise, confirmation, the kind that came heavy. "How bad?" "I read," she asked. Ben glanced back toward the trucks. "Bad enough that folks are scared." That was putting it gently. She could see it in the way people stood. Shoulders tight, eyes tired, pride still hanging on by its fingertips. Then Caleb Turner stepped forward. Just a month ago, he had leaned against a hardware counter and laughed at her like she was some grief-struck fool digging holes in dead land. Now his baseball cap was sweat-stained through, and his voice had lost every trace of swagger. "My dad's running a fever," he said. "We don't have enough clean water left to keep him cooled down." No performance, no clever tone, just a son asking. Evelyn looked past him at the others waiting near their trucks. A young mother with 2 little girls, an older ranch couple, a boy holding 3 empty milk jugs against his chest. Then she looked out across the orchard. The trenches, the stone basins, the shaded filtration beds. The old systems she had rebuilt one stubborn day at a time. This place had started as a plan to protect her son. Then it became proof. Now, standing there in the hard morning light, she understood it had become something else entirely. A choice. She could close the gate, guard what little they had, tell herself that survival began at home and ended there. Or she could do the harder thing, the right thing. Noah had come down the porch steps without her hearing him. He stood just off her shoulder, quiet, watching her face. She turned to him. For a moment, the whole world seemed to narrow to that one look between mother and son. Not because she needed permission, because she needed him to understand. "This will change everything," she said softly. He looked past her at the people waiting in the dust. Then he gave a small, steady nod. Then let it. So Evelyn opened the gate. There was no grand speech, no dramatic pause. She simply walked to the latch, lifted it free, and swung the gate wide. 2 containers per household this morning, she said, her voice calm and clear. No shoving, no taking more than your share. If you want more after that, you stay and help work. The people moved in slowly at first, almost reverently, like they were entering a church, or maybe a place they had no right to ask anything from. Martha Jane took charge of a line near the first holding basin. Sheriff Ben organized vehicles so nobody blocked the path. Lila May, pale but stronger now, sat under the porch shade writing names and amounts in a notebook. And Evelyn worked. She showed them how the water moved through the channels, how the stones slowed runoff, how the cloth and gravel beds filtered sediment, how shade, timing, and patience mattered just as much as effort. By noon, the orchard no longer looked like a dead place. It looked alive with purpose. Dusty boots moved between rows. Buckets passed hand to hand. Men who had once mocked her now followed instructions without argument. Then Caleb came back, not for himself this time. He stood in front of her holding an extra bucket, his eyes red from heat and shame and not enough sleep. I was wrong, he said quietly, about all of it. Evelyn wiped her hands on her jeans. The old hurt was still there somewhere. Not sharp anymore, but not gone. Still, she did not hand it back to him. Bring more gravel from the west pile, she said. Then I'll show you how to build your own catch bed. He blinked once, like mercy had caught him off guard. Then he nodded and turned to work. By late afternoon, the orchard had become the beating heart of Whispering Mesa. Not because it held plenty, it didn't. Not because Evelyn had performed some miracle, she hadn't. But because when everything else failed, this was the one place built on foresight instead of habit, on discipline instead of denial, on quiet courage instead of talk. And under that brutal sky, with the whole town learning how close it had come to breaking, the woman they once called foolish became the only steady thing left standing. By the end of that week, Whispering Mesa no longer sounded like the same town. The sharpness was gone. Not all at once. Not like in the movies, where one brave act fixes every broken thing by sundown. No, this change came slower than that. It came in the sound of shovels where there had once been laughter, in the sight of neighbors carrying stone instead of gossip, in men who used to stand around the hardware store talking big, now taking notes from a widow in a faded denim shirt, because the ground had finally taught them what pride never could. Each morning, the orchard filled early. Not with panic anymore, with purpose. Sheriff Ben helped organize work crews. Martha Jane brought sandwiches, clean towels, in a folding chair nobody ever saw her sit in. Lila May moved through the rows like she belonged there, writing down water levels, checking cloth filters, learning faster than anyone twice her age. And Caleb Turner? Caleb showed up before sunrise one morning with a flatbed trailer stacked with gravel, pipe, shade cloth, and lumber from his own store. He didn't make a speech, didn't ask to be forgiven. He just set down the tailgate and said, "Tell me where you need it." Sometimes that's how real change looks in a small American town. Not in perfect words, in humble work. Noah changed too. For weeks, Evelyn had watched grief sit on her son like a coat he couldn't take off. Quiet at breakfast, quiet in the truck, quiet at night when the house settled and everything reminded them of who was missing. But now she saw something new in him. One evening, as the sky turned copper over the orchard, Noah stood beside the west basin, teaching a younger boy how to pour slowly through the gravel bed so the water wouldn't stir up sediment. His voice was patient, steady, so much like Daniel's that it caught Evelyn off guard. For one aching second, grief rose in her chest so suddenly she had to look away. Not because it hurt more, because now it hurt alongside pride. And that was different. That was healing. A few days later, the first clouds gathered over the hills. Nobody trusted them at first. Whispering Mesa had spent too many weeks staring at empty skies. But by late afternoon, the wind shifted. Cooler, softer. Then came one drop, then another, then a slow, blessed rain that tapped across porch roofs, ran through the channels Evelyn had carved by hand, and darkened the thirsty ground row by row. No one cheered right away. People just stood there in it, hats off, faces lifted, quiet, as if they understood something sacred had happened. And it wasn't only the rain. Because the truth was, the town had started changing before the clouds ever broke. The rain helped, but it did not save them by itself. What saved them was humility, preparation, shared labor, the willingness to learn from the one person they had almost dismissed. That evening after the storm passed, Evelyn stood on the porch with Noah beside her. The orchard glistened in the fading light. Water moved gently through the basins. The dead trees were still dead. The land was still hard. Life was still life. Unfinished, imperfect, carrying both loss and mercy in the same breath. But now there was a future there, a real one. Noah slipped his hand into hers. "You were right," he said quietly. Evelyn looked out across the rows, where neighbors were still covering tools and laughing softly in the wet dusk. Then she answered the only honest way she could. "I was early," she said. "That's not always the same thing." And maybe that was the lesson Whispering Mesa would carry long after the drought was over. Sometimes the people who look strange are simply seeing farther than everyone else. Sometimes the ones who speak the least are building the thing that will hold others up. And sometimes the place everyone called dead is just waiting for someone patient enough, brave enough, and stubborn enough to believe life can return. So let me ask you, if your whole town laughed at what you were building, would you keep going anyway? And have you ever misjudged someone only to realize later they were stronger, wiser, and more prepared than anyone knew? If this story moved you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and share your answer in the comments. Because around here, we don't just tell stories about survival. We tell stories about a courage, quiet courage, that changes lives.